I miss the neo-Nazis. These were the words of a liberal biology professor at the University of Michigan last week, where I went to speak to the Jewish students who've experienced alarming bouts of anti-Semitism in recent months and years. This professor and his wife, also a professor as well, were Israelis who moved to America in the early 2000s. They proudly told me that they had given up, abandoned Israel years ago. They'd both clearly bought into the woke liberal ideologies that's pervasive in academia around the world. Of course, this is easy to do in a town like Ann Arbor. After I'd finished speaking to the students about Jewish pride and strength, and how October 7th was a wake-up call that the theory of a two-state solution had been clearly tried and failed miserably, and that we cannot continue to lie to ourselves about the realities on the ground. A wake-up call that the institutions that were put into place, supposedly to protect minorities and bring societies together, have all shown their true colors. As Jews, we can no longer be apologetic about who we are. We must not be apologetic about the land of Israel and what it means to us, what the state of Israel means to us as Jews. We must not be shy to say that we are proud Jews who come from Judea in the land of Israel, and that Zionism, which stands for the rights for Jews to self-determine on our ancestral homeland, is not something that the left or anyone is going to pry away from our identity. But as Jews, we also have a responsibility to become more literate about our Judaism, our religion, the Torah, and our history. As American Jews, we must continue to fight for and love this amazing nation that welcomed our families here with open arms, and whose freedom of religion is enshrined in the Constitution. We must fight for our rights to be preserved here, and against progressive forces around our country who are trying their best to remove Jews from the American dream. They will not succeed. As I've said previously, we must be able to properly articulate the fact that the U.S.'s support of Israel is in the United States' national security interest. Israel operates as a forward operating base for Western society, and particularly the United States of America, in the world's most dangerous neighborhood. Israel's enemies are America's enemies. Israel's allies are America's allies. Israel not only upholds the values that Americans hold so dear, but also fight against those who seek to destroy those values in our shared Western societies on a daily basis. So when these professors came to me after my speech at the University of Michigan and said, "We miss the neo-Nazis," I immediately responded, "I know why." They were surprised, as it was clear they were trying to get a rise out of me. I said, "Because you saw the neo-Nazis marching in Charlottesville, and when you did, you identified them immediately as your enemies. But this last year, you were blindsided, because it turns out that your enemies are also the people sitting right next to you. The same people you must have marched with for BLM, for George Floyd, and for gay rights, and for women's rights, and for everything in between. And now, they've all turned on you because you're Jews, Israeli Jews." And I turned to his wife and said, "You said you abandoned Israel years ago. But don't worry, neither Israel nor the Jewish people will ever abandon you." You see, anti-Semitism has been exploding in America for over 10 years. You just had to be willing to look. Back in 2014, anti-Semitism started doubling on the internet year over year. Back in 2016, Berkeley students going to class were already met with "Zionists should be sent to the gas chamber," painted on a school building. That same year, an Oberlin College professor posted online that Jews own all the banks, the media, the oil, and your government. Jewish students across America have been getting fake eviction notices on their dorm rooms for the better part of 10 years. Every year on so-called Apartheid Week in March, the protests from the intersectional left have made the lives of Jewish students miserable. Of course, facts are irrelevant to these anti-Semites. They do not care that Israeli Arabs have full and equal rights. They do not care that Israel is not a quote-unquote white state, as the largest group of Israelis are Mizrahi Jews who are from the Middle East. They don't care that Israel is the only country in the Middle East where women have full rights, where gay people can march on the streets, and even gay women can get free IVF to have babies. None of this is new. It simply has gotten so bad that no one can ignore it anymore. We've been saying it for years, and no one believed us. Why? Mostly because American Jews, for the most part, remain successful, strong, and in positions of influence. This is something we should be proud of. No one gave it to us. Quite the contrary. Talking about anti-Semitism is actually particularly hard for me because I'm not a fan of speaking about the Jewish community as being in a weak position, in the least. The reestablishment of the State of Israel not only meant the reestablishment of Jewish sovereignty over our ancestral homeland, but also the revitalization of Jewish strength and pride, something that was brutally taken away from Jews around the world by the Nazis. Today, the representation of the Jew is the State of Israel. It is the IDF, it is Jerusalem, and it's Tel Aviv. Today, Jews are strong and proud all around the world. Or they should be. If you look back in history, wherever and whenever there's economic unrest and political instability, society looks for someone to blame. Historically, that someone was the Jews. It's never been for any particular thing. But when a society is sick, they look at whatever the most loathsome quality is in their society, and the blame is cast on the Jews. Today, for the left, the enemy is the white man, the colonialist, the oppressor. So the Jews, for them, are all those things. For the neo-Nazis, the Jews continue to be race polluters. They hate immigrants and gays, so the Jews are the cause for all those things. For extremists in the Black American community, their enemy is the white man, and the Jews are the ultimate whites. And for all those anti-Semites, Israel is the Jew of the nations. A country to be blamed for absolutely everything, so that they don't have to focus on any of their own corrupt and vile leadership. If you need evidence of this, just watch any UN Human Rights Council meeting where the world's most disgusting and dictatorial regimes spend their time talking about Israel as a clear filibuster, so no one talks about what they do to their own people. It's a dangerous game of blame the Jew. Of course, in the Muslim world, anti-Semitism reigns supreme. Not all, of course, but most. By a lot. Back in 2010, Pew Research did a poll and found that over 95% of people in Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority-controlled cities, quote, hold unfavorable opinion of Jews. How nice. But you don't need a poll to know that. The alliance between Muslim extremists and progressives is a terrible formula for the Jewish people, for Israel, and the West. You could look at what happened in the streets of Amsterdam a few weeks ago, or what happens constantly on the streets of England, where the most common boy's name this year is Mohammed. Don't believe me? Look it up. Or you can look at your own college campuses, where you have a perfect example of reductio ad absurdum. It's almost as if it's a Saturday Night Live skit or an Onion article, but it's not. Queers for Palestine marching with Muslim students for Hamas, Hezbollah, and yes, ISIS. They burn Israeli flags, they burn American flags. But it's not just the students, it's the faculty. With over $54 billion flowing in from foreign governments in recent decades to American university, it's no surprise that our professors are amongst the worst purveyors of anti-Semitism on campus. They are brainwashing our next generation, not just to hate Israel and the Jews, but to hate America and everything America stands for. Our eyes must be wide open. The time for telling ourselves lies here in the West is over. In this week's episode, we're joined by Shabbos Kestenbaum, a recent Harvard graduate who famously has sued Harvard for not protecting Jewish students in gross violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Remember, in December 2009, President Trump passed an executive order expanding the protections of Title VI, which prohibits schools from receiving federal funds if they don't protect students being discriminated against based on their race, color, and national origin. He expanded it to include Jews, who, as you know, are an ethnicity and a religion, or an ethno-religion. So Kestenbaum filed this suit, which he states is going to be the first of its kind to actually go to trial. Many of us saw Shabbos speak powerfully at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, which was amazing to see. And he's been making the rounds ever since. He's young, smart, and eloquent. We had a great discussion, and I think you'll really enjoy it. This is Standpoint, And I'm Gabe Gross. Mess with. So Shabbos is in town and we said, you got to come into the studio and chat. So Shabbos, nice to see you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So first, let's just start. I mean, the first time I really saw you was at the RNC. I was there in the crowd in Milwaukee. First of all, it's a crazy experience to be at a political convention. I've been in politics for over a decade, never been to a convention. So that was a crazy experience. But how did you end up at the RNC and as the speaker of the RNC?
Sure. I mean, first, let me validate how crazy it was, because the last convention, in fact, the only other convention I'd ever been at, was as a 17-year-old Bernie Sanders supporter at the 2016 Democratic National Convention.
I'm not going to do something for you, to you. We should post the picture of you at that convention, because right. I've seen it. And I'm just happy that you've been red-pilled and you're on this side now, but you look better, you sound better. Anyways, go ahead.
So you know, the story, it's so odd. I remember this very clearly. I was driving to the Hamptons. I was speaking at a pro-Israel rally, and all of a sudden my phone rings, and it's a woman. She says, "My name is Brittany. I work for the Republican National Convention. We've been following your story, and we'd be interested in having you speak." And I was so caught off guard by that question. I've been a registered Democrat since the day I turned 18. I didn't really process what she was asking. And I was running super late. So I said, you know what, can I just call you back? And I completely forgot about it until 2-3 days later. She calls me back and she follows up. And I said, oh, so you're actually being serious. This is a real thing you want me to do. And I was very transparent. I said, look, I'm a Democrat. I don't know who I'll be supporting, but if you really want me to, it'd be an honor. But honestly, even before I said that, I was actually conflicted, because at that point, I was not ready to endorse President Trump. And there were a lot of policy disagreements I had with the Republican Party, and I wasn't sure whether to do it. And after speaking to a couple of different people, I realized this was something that I should do. I would be an idiot not to. If you are given a platform in front of the former president, in front of 30,000 people in an arena, in front of millions of Americans watching on TV, to amplify the voices of Jewish students on college campuses who are experiencing discrimination, persecution, oppression, you take that opportunity. So it was a surreal experience and something I will always remember for the rest of my life.
So tell me, I mean, you say you've been registered a Democrat your whole life. It's been 7 years. Your voting life has been a total of 7 years, right? You're 25 years old. I'll admit to the audience that when I was 18, I registered as a Democrat as well. I didn't vote for Democrats in every presidential election, including with Obama, who I'd never voted for. But after Obama was elected the first time, his first speech outside of the country, which was about a month later, someone can fact check me, was in Cairo, exactly, and he gave a speech on his new vision for the Middle East. And I can't wait till someone finds this online. I don't know how to even look it up, but I opened my laptop while he was speaking. I looked at my wife, I was already married, and I said, I can't be affiliated with this guy at all. And I changed my registration at that point to NPA, to no party affiliation in Florida, which is basically independent, except independents are their own party, at least here in Florida. So I changed it because I couldn't be affiliated with him, and then eventually made my way to the Republican Party, because it's very easy to be in the middle and be this sort of snooty, intellectual. It says, well, I don't really fit well with either party. And, at the end of the day, you have to pick a team, you have to pick a party and push to improve it to get to where you want it to be. Tell me, Shabbos, what was your sort of journey flipping over? You said you were having policy issues. You weren't sure, even up until the convention, who you were going to vote for. What did you see in the Democratic Party that made you want to shift over to the Republican Party?
Sure. So first of all, even when I was 9 years old, I remember buying a Hebrew language Barack Obama yard sign that we put in the front lawn. At the age of 12, I was knocking on doors for then Newark Mayor Cory Booker when he was running for the Senate. I was, of course, at the Democratic Convention as a supporter of Bernie. I volunteered for the Jamal Bowman campaign. I'm happy to compare my progressive...
Keeps getting worse.
I know. I'm happy to compare my progressive credentials any day of the week. And the reason I say this and articulate it so openly is to demonstrate just how mightily the Democratic Party has lost favor in the eyes, not just of me, but of many, many Jewish Americans. So as you said, I'm 25, I'm young. I was 4 years old during the Second Intifada. I was not alive during the First Intifada, any of the Lebanon Wars, Yom Kippur, Six-Day War, Suez Canal Crisis. Israel is a place where your family lives. I lived there for 3 years when I was studying in yeshiva. It's not something that you particularly worry about. On the night of October 7th, what we young American Jews experienced was something we had never experienced before, and that's Israel as an existential issue. Israel, where its legitimacy, its survival is very much called into question. So even as a 17-year-old, I disagreed with Senator Sanders' policies when it came to foreign aid, when it came to Israel in particular. I just didn't think it mattered as much, because Israel is a strong, independent Western country. In fact, there are many hardline settlers in Israel right now who will say we shouldn't accept American foreign aid. We should be self-sufficient and self-reliant. So I disagreed with Sanders. I just didn't think it was a problem. And then October 7th happens, and you realize that, no, wait a minute. Israel's survival is at stake. American Jews are being targeted for their faith on college campuses, in the synagogues of LA and the subways of New York. So I basically became a one-issue voter. I believe very strongly that we should have serious legislation to combat climate change. I'm in favor, to some extent, of reproductive choices. But at the same time, those pale in comparison to the fact that you have 7 American hostages, now unfortunately 6. Omer Nutra has definitively been proven to have been killed in captivity. You have rampant anti-Semitism, and you have Israel, where it's being attacked by 7 fronts. Those were the issues I cared about. And I remember going to the Democratic National Convention. I was there. And I remember even beforehand telling political operatives, telling policymakers, amplify Jewish students. Why is it that only the Republicans should talk about anti-Semitism? And fine, you don't want me to speak because you think I'm a MAGA fascist? Here's a list of dozens of young progressive Jews on college campuses who want to support Joe Biden and eventually Kamala Harris. And they're experiencing discrimination. Talk about it. And they refused. You know, Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, of course, the incoming Senate Minority Leader, he lied to our faces. He doesn't meet with Jewish students. He sends his surrogates. And the surrogates told us to our faces that he will bring the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act to a floor vote in the Senate before the election. Of course, that didn't happen. Now the new excuse is he'll do it before January. That's not going to happen either. He wants to put it as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, because that would shield Democratic senators from revealing who they actually voted, how they actually voted. So we've been let down time and time again. As Ronald Reagan said, I did not abandon the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party abandoned me. I said a year ago, if any of the two parties were to implement policies that will alleviate our concerns, I will support that party. But when it came to expelling non-American students on a foreign visa who violate American law, when it came to taxing university endowments, when it came to cracking down on DEI, withholding federal funds to anti-Semitic colleges, only one candidate took that seriously, and that was Donald Trump. I'll give you one last example. I was at the grave of the Lubavitcher Rebbe on October 7th, 2024, and I helped accompany President Trump, and we prayed for the hostages. It was incredibly meaningful. We were there with Ben Shapiro, a family of the hostage, Idan Alexander, an Auschwitz survivor. Kamala Harris was invited to give prayer to hostages. She was asked to do it, and she said no. So you want us to vote for you when you won't even meet with Jewish students? You won't even pray for the hostages? I mean, you have to give us a reason. You have to stop taking American Jews for granted. And that is obvious that the Democratic Party has been doing that for decades.
So two responses. First is on the last point you're saying about taking American Jews for granted. Senator Joe Lieberman, who passed away recently, was in the middle of drafting an op-ed with Alan Dershowitz to the Democratic Party when he died. They were going back and forth with drafts. Dershowitz published that, and people can look that up online. And that was exactly his point. He said, I've been a Democrat my whole life, despite the fact that he ran the last time as an independent. That was because he lost his primary and he still won. And then he caucused with the Democrats. So he was still a Democrat. By the way, I was blessed to have known him and being able to become friends with him while I was in law school in Washington, D.C. and eat at his house. And by the way, I have to say this story, which is a total side story, but he invited my wife and I, we had just been married, to have lunch at their house on a Saturday afternoon, a Shabbat afternoon. And he was there with some other big intellectuals, a professor, he's a senator, and then someone else that works in the Senate, and then me and my wife, or my wife and I. And we are sitting there, and he's talking about Israel. This is 2003, 2004. It's after the Intifada. He's talking about, after the Intifada. So after the Second Lebanon War, and he's talking about what's the future for Israel and for American Jews. And I'm just listening. I'm in awe. I'm a kid. I always love this stuff, but I'm not gonna say anything in this table, right? And he looks at me and he says, I want to hear what you have to say about this, Gabe. And I said, Senator, who am I? I'm just interested to learn from you. I know when I can speak and when I can listen, and there's a moment to listen. He says, no, we're just a bunch of old guys talking through things that we've been talking through for 30 years. We'd love to hear your perspective. And that was sort of a moment, like a learning lesson for me in life, of always making sure to include people to hear their perspectives and learn from them. But anyway, so he took that same point that you took of saying, the Democratic Party, if you want to keep the Jewish vote, you better do something for the Jewish community here in the United States and in Israel. And they haven't, and somehow they still did They did better than they should have done. The Democrats did. I think there's still a lot of work for us to do in the American Jewish community, but they did worse than they have ever done with the Jewish community, at least in several decades. But I do want to go back on something it's almost to challenge you, but you may or may not agree with this. But we always hear when they're talking about anti-Semitism, when we talk about anti-Semitism, that anti-Semitism is a canary in a coal mine. Like if you want to look at the health and evaluate the health of a society, look and see where they're at with anti-Semitism and with Israel. It's on both issues. And they're, like we know, they're inextricably intertwined. So when you say you're a one-issue voter, it's actually not one issue. Right. So it's one issue or two issues, anti-Semitism in Israel, that are reflective of everything else. Right. Because the way that Donald Trump and the Republican Party are dealing with foreign policy and with terrorist groups around the world. Right. That impacts Israel and the Jewish community here. Climate change is its own separate thing. I'm glad to talk about it. Right. But there's climate change. I think that the Republican Party, I've been around that issue a long time, has as many solutions as the Democratic Party. They just, when it falls apart when we're talking about climate change or how much is of the changes, if there are changes, are man-made or not man-made. But we live in Miami here. In Miami, we care. The sea level is rising. It might be cyclical. It might go back down. But we need to make sure that we can keep our homes, our properties safe, and our families safe. So there's lots of solutions that are being proposed for that. We want to keep our water clean. When I was mayor in Bal Harbour, we changed all our water systems, and it had nothing to do with climate change or environmentalism. It was just clean air and clean water. And I think we're going to see a lot of that, by the way, out of Lee Zeldin, who's a new EPA administrator, who's a friend. He's been on the podcast, not to talk about the EPA, but these are practical solutions that aren't sort of swept up into these grandiose political discussions, right? So I just wanted to point out that from my perspective, Jews often will say, American Jews will often say, I'm a one-issue voter, but I'm like, no, that issue, all the other issues, all the other policy positions impact the Jewish community here in the United States and in Israel. Take New York City, for example, and the migrants, right? If you have over 800,000 illegal immigrants in the city and crime is up, even if the mayor, who does everything that the Jewish community asks him for, he's a friend, by the way, Eric Adams, I saw him this week. I was with him in Israel last year. I mean, he's been unbelievable. But you know what? When crime is up against everybody, including the Jewish community. And when you can't hire police officers because of policies that you have regarding defunding the police or being overly aggressive in investigating police officers in questionable situations, as opposed to just regular accountability issues, people don't want to be cops. So then when there's a protest, the cops don't want to get involved in the protests, and then the Jewish community gets hit. So it's all sort of intertwined. But you can answer that, or I'd love to talk about the way you really got brought onto the scene is you were at Harvard, and we call it the Michigan of the East. I went to Michigan, but you were at Harvard, and you ended up suing Harvard, which is interesting. I did a Title VI claim against University of California, Berkeley. We didn't have a plaintiff though, so I went to the Department of Education, where it's still sitting nicely on a shelf. But tell me about your case. What happened to you at Harvard, and how you ended up bringing a lawsuit against them?
Sure. Well, firstly, I'm gonna just say I certainly agree with the first point. To me, anti-Semitism, especially anti-Semitism on American college campuses and within institutions of higher learning, is sort of an amalgamation or perhaps a manifestation of deeper societal ills, of a lack of meaning, a lack of purpose, a focus on racial and sexual identity over intellectual diversity, a severe case of political indoctrination. And the manifestation of that is, of course, anti-Semitism, because as you said, we are the canary in the coal mine, but we're also canary in the coal mine of what's a much larger issue. As I always say, yes, the protesters at Harvard and elsewhere, they'll chant death to Israel, but we all know that they chant death to America in the next sentence. I mean, I have seen personally, not just the Israeli flag being ripped or burnt, but the American flag as well. In fact, the Columbia University Apartheid Divestment Coalition, they have openly stated on their social media that their sole goal is, quote, the eradication of Western civilization. So it's not just a Jewish issue. It's not just an anti-Semitism issue. It's an American issue. And unfortunately, Harvard purports to train the next generation of American leaders. And by and large, they're kind of right. It's not an exaggeration at all to state, statistically speaking, I probably sat in a class with a future president, congressman, senator, and if these are America's future leaders, those who after October 7th, I had serious debates with as to whether the nails lodged inside of Jewish women by Hamas on October 7th constitute rape or not, then we as a country, forget about Jews, as a country are at a serious, dangerous inflection point. Because these will be the future policymakers, judges, authors of the books our kids will read.
And just interject before we go to the next thing, all we have to do is look across the pond. Because right. in Europe, where you have a big mixture of the worst formula in the world for Western society, but also for Jews, which we always seem to be first in this line of attack, but is liberalism, hard progressive societies with mass amounts of Muslims, which have a piece of them that are, not all of them obviously, but you have Islamists in there, which are the extremists within the Muslims. And yes, even if it's only a small percentage, with 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, 5% or 10% of that are serious numbers that can really impact the society.
For sure. And also what makes anti-Semitism so remarkable in a deeply negative way is that it creates this unholy coalition, this unholy alliance between radical Islamists, between the LGBTQ plus community, between feminists. I mean, these are fundamentalist groups that otherwise would not see eye to eye on any issue. But the Jew is sort of this unifying force, and it really amplifies how pervasive the problem is. In terms of Harvard University, so I wrote an article called Antisemitism at Harvard, and I wrote it in October of 2021. And no one read it. The article did not really elicit outrage, but it was there. It was there. Obviously, evidently.
Where'd you publish it?
I published it for Aish.com, which is a local Jewish publication online. And it became obvious within the first month of being a Harvard student that there was this double standard at best when it came to the treatment of minority students and the treatment of Jews, and at worst, just normalized, accepted, and celebrated anti-Semitism. I mean, I can give you example after example, but I think this, of course, came onto the scene on October 7th. People often ask me, what was anti-Semitism like at Harvard post-October 7th? And the reality is there was no post-October 7th. It was the night of October 7th. So I was at the Harvard Chabad, and it's the joyous Jewish holiday of Simchas Torah. We're dancing, we're celebrating, and these rumors begin to circulate. There was a bombing, there was a shooting. The reality is, as I said, I lived in Israel for 3 years. A rabbi of mine was stabbed to death outside of Jaffa Gate. There is terrorism. It's a sad, unfortunate reality of having a modern Jewish state, but it happened, so we didn't think much of it. The problem was, as the night went on, the rumors persisted and the rumors were strengthened, and it became readily apparent that what we young American Jews were experiencing was something we could never even conceive of. And I was on a panel with MLK's niece a couple of weeks ago, Alvida, and she reminded me of this brilliant line from her uncle: "We won't remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." At Harvard University, at Columbia, Penn, NYU, MIT, we would have been lucky to have the silence of our friends. To me, the story of October 7th is not what Hamas did. Hamas is a brutal, dictatorial, tyrannical regime that should be wiped off the face of this earth. But they state openly their goal is the eradication of the Jewish state from the river to the sea. Hassan Nasrallah, the now since deposed head of Hezbollah, he said dozens of times, all the Jews should move to Israel because it would be so much more convenient to kill them in one locale than hunt them down door to door elsewhere. So we know what they're capable of. What we were not prepared for was the most intelligent, the most educated, the most articulate, the most progressive, those who introduce themselves with preferred gender pronouns, who take knees for Black Lives Matter. On the night of October 7th, they were watching in real time on live TV as Jewish women are bleeding from their private areas, as Jewish babies like Kfir Bibas is being hoarded onto motorcycles, deported into Gaza. They see mangled, charred bodies, and 34 student groups at Harvard University representing more than 1,000 students, the best and brightest, allegedly, of our society. They jump out of their beds, some were still in their pajamas, and they draft what they called an emergency statement to blame Jews for the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. That's not hyperbole, that's not exaggeration, that's not conjecture. The statement literally begins: "We hold the Israeli apartheid regime entirely responsible for all unfolding violence in the Middle East." This is the night of October 7th. There's no retaliation. There's no both sides. And the Religion and Public Life Department, where I took a significant number of my classes at Harvard, I study religion and politics, they released their own statement on October 9th or 10th. And they say, if you begin the story on October 7th and not the story of the Nakba, if you begin the story on October 7th and not Jewish supremacy and not the illegal displacement of Palestinians, you'll only get one side of the story. Both of those statements from the professors and from the students, you know how many times they mention or condemn Hamas? Zero. And in fact, PBS Frontline has a great documentary called The Crisis on Campus. It's free on YouTube. You guys should all watch it. And they interview me. I give them my shtick. And they interview 3 of the leading anti-Israel activists at Harvard. These are 3 girls at Harvard Law School. And they say, this is now in April, given the blowback, the hurt generated by your statement, you regret not mentioning Hamas. These 3 girls, they look at each other and they say, no, we didn't think it was relevant. We didn't think it was relevant? To see the murder on live TV of 45 American citizens, the abductions of dozens of American citizens, including at least 6 who are still being held there. The reaction of the best and brightest of our given society is to side with the terrorists who did that thing. Now you can appreciate what I tell President Trump, what I tell Democrats and Republicans in the Senate and the House, what I tell the national media. It's not just a Jewish issue. It's an issue that strikes at the core of our Western civilization, our liberal democracy, our American values. When you have future leaders who are animated by the murder of Jews and adamant that Western civilization is morally corrupt, that needs to have some type of usurpation or reformation. That is dangerous. And I can give you a laundry list of incidents that happened after October 7th about the physical assault at Harvard Business School against a Jewish student. Another Jewish student was spat on for wearing a kippah. An Israeli student was told by her professor to leave the class because her nationality made other students uncomfortable. A Harvard employee vandalized all of my hostage posters, writing on Kfir Bibas, his head is still on, where's the evidence? Writing on Noah Argamani that Jews are best friends with Jeffrey Epstein. He then challenged me to debate him in an underpass as to whether Jews orchestrated 9/11. He then posted a video taunting me with a machete saying he wants to fight. I mean, I had private armed security outside my house for a week. I had a guy with a gun follow me to Chabad to make sure I was okay. And of the dozens of emails and phone calls I made to Harvard inquiring about his employment status, to this day, they've never once responded. It is inconceivable that any other minority group would be treated with the disdain, the disregard, and the contempt that Harvard routinely treats its Jewish students. And the most damning part, this is not even a unique story. I mean, you're interviewing me. You can interview thousands of other Jewish students across college campuses, and they'll basically tell you more or less what I'm just telling you now.
Tell me, so we had Talia Khan here months ago from MIT, who had her own kind of crazy experiences on campus. But I'd love to hear your exactly on that last issue you spoke about, because when I speak to people, we live in Miami. Miami is a little bit of a bubble. Miami is, I won't say probably, Miami is absolutely the best place outside of Israel to be an open, proud, connected, Zionist Jewish person in the world. I mean, the community here is huge. We have great relationships with the Cuban Catholics, with the Black community. We're ingrained in this community in a way that I haven't seen anywhere else where there's a strong Jewish community, right? I mean, just last weekend we had 3,000 Jews gather for over a 5-day period for a Maccabi game sporting event. And yes, we had security like everywhere else. Not one incident, not one protester, not one complaint. Just doesn't happen here. The problem with that is when you speak to people here, not just Jewish people, and you speak about what's happening at the universities, they'll very quickly say, this is just an elitist issue. It's Harvard, it's Columbia, etc. I have my own response to this question, but I want to hear yours. What have you seen? You've been working on this issue now for over a year at least. What have you seen all over the country outside of sort of the elite Ivy League universities? Are we seeing the same thing there? What are we seeing?
For sure. I would say it's more pronounced at the Ivy League simply because the media is more interested in that story. So the congressional hearing on December 5th, when the presidents of MIT and Penn and Harvard were brought in, that's a very sensational story. Everyone wants to take part in it, but the reality is there were a lot of other hearings with a lot of other campuses, whether it was the University of Maryland or the University of Michigan or UCLA or Rutgers. I mean, all of the CUNYs, for example, it is a pervasive and systemic problem. Unfortunately, it's not just an Ivy League problem. And I'll give you one personal anecdote. I was in Poland. I go to Poland very often. When I'm not suing Harvard, I actually study the Holocaust. That's my academic interest. And I was brought to the Jewish Community Center in Krakow, and they wanted to hear from me what anti-Semitism was like in the United States. This is the Polish Jewish community, 90% of whom were killed during the Holocaust. And I tell them how we once had Yishai Ribo come to sing for Jewish students.
An Israeli pop singer.
And he served in the Israeli occupying forces, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. And the reaction from students was not only to have a vicious boycott, but was to protest outside the venue, saying, glory to the martyrs, globalize the Intifada. We had to have, 15 armed guards. Chabad had to hire them. And I remember writing to DEI saying, at the very least, can you condemn the fact that our fellow classmates have made it so unsafe to sing Hava Nagila and Am Yisrael Chai that we have to have security? And they said, well, we're sorry you feel the need to hire security, but this does not fall under our purview. And which, first of all, is incorrect. But second of all, I remember saying this story to the Jewish Community Center in Krakow. And as I'm talking, I noticed the CEO of the Jewish Community Center, Jonathan's in the back. And I say, Jonathan, you've been with the Polish Jewish community for 20 years. Have you ever had to hire 15 armed guards for any event here in Poland? He said, we've never had to hire one.
Wow.
But to be a Jew on Harvard's campus in Boston, Massachusetts, you better believe you have to hire security, and you need it. At Cornell, a student threatened to shoot up the Hillel. At the University of Michigan, just last month, there was another physical assault. I was speaking at the University of Pittsburgh about 2 months ago. As I am speaking to the students get an alert on their phone that there was just a physical assault against a Jewish student, and they chanted, racial expletives. This is not an Ivy League problem. It's not anything to do with free speech or anti-Zionism. We're not exaggerating. This is a profound problem where Jewish students are quite literally in physical danger. And it is a damning indictment on the state of higher education. For Jewish students to receive equity, equality, and justice, what do they have to do? They have to resort to a court of law. They have to sue their university and hope that a judge has enough pity on them to institute the structural reforms that the university should be doing on their own, which is why, whether you like Trump or not, whether you like the tweets and the rhetoric, I think Jewish people should acknowledge reality. There is only one candidate who has forcefully and consistently stood with the Jewish community and articulated clear policies he would implement to make sure that this does not happen again. And if Kamala Harris wanted to support those policies, great. I would have supported her. She refused to even meet with Jewish students, let alone acknowledge the reality of anti-Semitism on our college campuses. So to me, it was sort of a no-brainer. The longer I did this, the more students I met, the more horrific the stories I was hearing. It was a no-brainer who I had to support, and more importantly, the policies we have to implement to make sure Jewish students are finally protected.
What's interesting is a few things. First, the first point I want to make is when you talk about Harvard breeding the next generation of leaders, right? We've been talking about this for years, for 10 years or so, on when anti-Semitism has been rising for the last 10 years or so. If anyone looks at the numbers, saying that these same people making these statements are going to be our leaders in a few years. And we're seeing them now. Some of them are in office, but most of them are staffers. And if you look at the staff members in the Democratic Party under 30 years old that have expressed any opinions on the United States, on capitalism, on colonialism, on Israel, on Gaza, on what's happening, it's all the same people. And really, it's pretty simple. Sometimes we like to be overly intellectual on things and analyze things, not just here, just in life. But you were talking about those three students, the three women from Harvard who were the leaders of the protest movement or whatever they were, and asking if they regret not writing that they blame Hamas for killing and raping people in Israel on October 7th. They said they had no regrets. If in 5 years those people are advising a member of Congress on an issue, on any issue about America, not just about Israel, not just about the Jews, what do you think they're going to say? It's going to be a disaster. And we don't have to guess, because that's what's happening now. I work in politics. And if you talk to any member of Congress from the Democratic side, they have to work hard. The ones that are still good have to work hard to figure out who they're hiring, who are their advisors, who's giving them their memos, what are they doing? Because that's who's the next group of folks that are coming into politics on the Democratic side. Not that we don't have our own set of issues on the Republican side. We do. There's no panacea. Nothing's perfect. But when we're talking about Trump, when people were talking about why would he be good for the Jewish community, he's just saying good things. No, he actually did good things. You brought a Title VI claim, right? So Title VI, which purports to provide protection, it says if you receive any federal funding at your educational institution, you must provide adequate protections for people based on their nationality, ethnicity, and race, correct? Yeah. And it was never clear, Judaism, what is it? Because it doesn't say religion in Title VI. Judaism, for those who don't know, is actually an ethno-religion, or just an ethnicity. I call it an ethno-religion, ethnicity, because it gets passed down by your mother to you. So that's what makes it an ethnicity. That's why we're a people. It's also a religion. People debate on this. Rudy Rockman was here. He said it's not a religion. It is also a set of beliefs. So that's why for me it's a religion, but we can have that debate. But the point is, it was a question. And because of that, until that point, Title VI wasn't clearly there to protect Jewish students. And what point am I talking about? Is President Trump passed an executive order to explicitly make sure that Jews are protected under Title VI. That is the reason why you were able to bring a claim, period. Now, Biden didn't rescind it, so I'll give him that credit. But what he did do, and I filed a claim against UC Berkeley, so I know this, they just let all the complaints that came into the Department of Education just sit. And if we're seeing what Trump has in store, I'd love to hear what you know about that. But I've spoken to some folks around the now transition team, not the campaign, and I know for a fact that they're working on executive orders for day one to really put the screws into the universities and K through 20, really, because it's not just the universities. So all levels of school, to make sure that they're not engaged in not just anti-Israel, but anti-Western, anti-Americanism. Really strong stuff that we're going to see coming. And I also know some folks that they're talking about, which I won't say, to run the OCR, the Office of Civil Rights. And if any of those folks that I know are being spoken to are going to run that office, there's going to be a huge change in America. What have you heard?
Yeah, we're probably thinking of the same people. And I couldn't agree with you more. If those people are in charge of the OCR, you would finally see cases that you're referring to, cases that have been sitting on the desks of the OCR for years and years now. Finally, we would either see them being addressed, or we would see significant action under Trump's executive orders, directing the Department of Education, directing the Department of Justice to actually prosecute crime again, to actually withhold federal funds from universities. Because the reality is the laws on the books are pretty good as is. So the executive order you're referring to, I think it was 13899 in 2019 that Trump signed, that's really good. The problem is enforcement. And we have seen under the Biden administration, zero enforcement, not just of anti-Semitism on college campuses, but if you remember, for example, that riot outside of the Adas Torah synagogue in Los Angeles, where mass protesters were preventing Jewish worshipers from entering the synagogue. I don't care that Biden condemns it on Twitter. I care that he says, well, hey, the Department of Justice currently has a hate crime task force. All we're going to do is mobilize the DOJ and just prosecute crime. I mean, if you really want to combat anti-Semitism, if you really want to stomp out hate, hate's an ideology. Unfortunately, there will always be racists. It's a disgusting ideology, but you can't dictate or legislate your way out of a mentality. What you can do is say, if you're a bus driver and in the 21st century you tell an African American to sit in the back, your ass is going to jail that day. But when it comes to anti-Semitism, for whatever reason, our reaction is, well, go to a Holocaust museum, go to Israel, meet with some Jewish kids. Those are all good things, but it's not a substitute for following the law. If we had leadership, not just in the White House, but on our college campuses, who said you have every right to exercise your free speech and expose yourself to the world as being a morally bankrupt, intellectually challenged moron, you can do it. But the moment you put your hands on a student, the moment you tell a Jewish student you can't study in the library today, you will be expelled. You will be suspended. If you break American law, you will be arrested. It's not rocket science, just prosecute crime. But we are living in an era of a crisis of accountability, whether it's the southern border, whether it's the subways of New York, like that shooting, targeted assassination we saw yesterday in broad daylight in the streets of Manhattan, or our college campuses. People refuse to take any sense of responsibility or accountability for their actions. And we have district attorneys, we have mayors, we have governors, and yes, we have presidents who refuse to prosecute crime. That would be the most effective deterrent against anti-Semitism. And that's why I'm so ecstatic about President Trump and the team that he is assembling, because these are people who recognize that the solutions are fairly obvious. We're not reinventing the wheel here. We are just going to enforce the laws that are already on the book. And as you quite rightly pointed out, I would not have a lawsuit. I would not have a claim. And by the way, we are the first case in American history pertaining to the civil rights violations of Jewish students on a college campus that's actually going to trial. Usually these cases are dismissed or they're settled. We are going all the way to the courts. And that is a direct result of strong executive leadership from President Trump. And I'll add one last point. I remember when I was still trying to save my party from itself, trying to convince any Democratic lawmaker, any Democratic political operative, anyone who would listen. I tried getting them to take the issue of anti-Semitism seriously. You know, I was begging the White House, have a stupid roundtable with a bunch of, Jewy-looking Jews, and we'll kiss Biden's feet and we'll say how great he is, but at least we'll have an audience, or it doesn't have to be me. Jewish students will be able to have an audience with the president and tell him what they're going through, because I don't even think he realizes. I mean, he clearly doesn't realize much. I don't think he realizes the extent of how bad it is. And they just refused every single time. So the Office of Civil Rights, for example, they would say, look, we know what we're doing because look how many investigations we opened. The Office of Civil Rights currently is worse than useless because it is a way for the federal government to pretend that they're doing anything serious to combat these issues, when in reality, to this day, there has not been a single investigation conducted by the Office of Civil Rights that have resulted in the firing of a professor, in serious structural reforms. What usually happens is they reach an understanding that we promise to do better, and then they don't. And so I always tell people, and especially Democratic lawmakers, when they said, oh, if you want to help combat anti-Semitism, we have to fund the Office of Civil Rights. No, you don't. Because even when they're operating at 100%, they're still pretty useless. I mean, half of them don't even go to work anymore. They work from home, which is a problem that Chairwoman Virginia Fox always talks about. Yeah. The problem is not the money. The problem is the OCR themselves. They don't seriously tackle the issues, which is why I always encourage students, if you want accountability, if you want structural reforms, you can't rely on the Department of Education. Go through the private court system. And that has proven to be very effective thus far. And I'm incredibly optimistic that under our new president, the OCR will once again be an institution that I would feel confident telling Jewish students, yeah, you can trust them.
Yeah, and politics and government as a whole, there's a big trickle-down effect. No pun intended, not talking about economics for a second, but there is a trickle-down effect with leadership. So if the president starts really pushing with the OCR with cases against these universities, right, that start going places, the states can do the same thing, right? Because the states have real oversight over their universities through their boards of regents or boards of governors, depending on which state it is. They provide state funding, which is usually more than the federal funding that they even get. There's a lot of levers that they can pull. They can fire the presidents or the deans of the universities because they're appointed by the board. Especially in the public school system, or only in this public school system, but there's a lot that can be done, and they really take their cues, whether consciously or subconsciously, they take their cues from the White House and from the federal government, and you see that trickle down. But I do want to thank you for doing that, because I've been involved in lots of these cases. I'm a part of the case now suing the Associated Press. We can do a show on that, for knowingly hiring a Hamas photographer, a Hamas affiliated photographer, or paying for his photographs. But I know the reason why there's no federal cases brought for students other than yours is because it's hard to get students to want to put their names on one of these cases and what impact it's had. So I know that it was a big decision. Maybe people are seeing you with behind the lights and doing interviews and speaking, but I do know that it's not an easy decision putting yourself out there. So I appreciate you doing that, and I appreciate you taking the time to come into the studio and chatting. So thanks for coming in.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
All right, man. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, and do all the great things you do to support podcasts, and we'll see you next time.